Whilst there is a lot of bike shedding, new ways to approach old problems where new ways are just not needed, and countless discussions that devolve into whether or not a problem should even be solved, Wayland is continuously progressing and problems are being ironed out. And whilst Wayland devs might not agree with your solution or agree with there being a problem, oftentimes they're at least willing to hear about the problem and willing to at least discuss it and have a back and forth about it. But there is one Wayland issue that got so heated and was so counter to what Wayland was trying to be that I've locked this issue. Please do not continue posting links to it in all of the other issues, as this is effectively spam and will lead to your account being blocked. This issue was created 2 years ago. Wayland issue 233. Reference Wayland server and standard desktop APIs, created by Artem S. Tashkanov. Now, you may recognize who this is if you frequent the Phoronix forums. Often they'll go by names like Brodie and Avis. If you know who that is, I think you know where we're going with this. If you don't know who that is, you are in for a very special treat, so be sure to stick around. This issue is basically asking for the Wayland equivalent of Xorg. So as it currently stands, every single Wayland compositor basically either has to build everything from scratch if there's something like Kwin, Mutter, Western, or more likely, build upon a compositor library like WRoots, but they still have to build that entire compositor stack themselves. In the case of Xorg and a Wayland equivalent of Xorg, what you would do if you wanted to build a window manager is you would build a window manager. All of that complicated graphic server stuff is just already done for you. Obviously, even if this existed, you could still go and build your own implementation if you wanted to. Like some people have gone and built their own X11 implementations, it's just most people don't do that. Most people, if they want to build a window manager, they build a window manager and rely on that singular implementation they know everybody's going to have. That singular implementation being Xorg. And this wanted the same thing to exist on Wayland. As it currently stands, all the Wayland compositors must implement, some of which are yet to be standardized, screen recording and casting, remote desktop, VNC, RDP, etc., and management, AnyDesk, TeamViewer, etc. This is from a couple of years ago. This is a very solved problem now. Querying of the mouse position, keyboard layout and LED state, caps, scroll, num, active window position or name, moving windows, XDO tool, WM control, so on and so forth. For some of this tooling doesn't exist, but a lot of this can just be done generically on WRoots. You just get it for free if you use that library. Global shortcuts. This is a problem that is just barely being solved. The implementations that do have it solved now are basically just saying, you know what? I actually don't care about the Wayland way to do it. Like Hyperland just says, okay, this application is allowed to listen to your keyboard on these specific keys. It doesn't actually have a proper solution. There is a portal that exists. The problem is applications are currently not using that portal, but this is going to be solved in some amount of time. System tray. This isn't a problem with the compositor. This is a problem with your bar, and any sensible bar actually does have a system tray available. Input method support / editor. IM. This allows you to type in character sets outside of the Latin character set. Things like Japanese kanji, for example, or whatever the Korean character set's called. I don't know. But like, it lets you type in things that are not just what you would type for words in English. This is more of a toolkit concern. Most toolkits do support this fairly well now. I believe back at this point, it was a little bit wonky. It's still kind of wonky now, but it's less wonky. Graphical settings management, i.e. tools like Xrender. If you build off of something like WRoots, you just get support for this for free. There is WRoots generic tooling that'll work across basically every compositor unless you're doing something really, really weird. Fast user switching / multiple graphical sessions. This is a weird one to include because this has nothing to do with Wayland or Xorg. This is a matter for your display manager, your login screen. Session configuration, including but not limited to 1. Input devices, 2. Monitor configuration, including refresh rate, resolution, scaling, rotation, power saving, 3. Global shortcuts. Global shortcuts at this point were not implemented, nowadays are still like barely implemented. Input devices there are generic tools for, and monitor configuration there are generic tools for. HDR/deep color support. There wasn't support anywhere on Linux for this back in 2021. We are just barely getting support in games. This is another really weird inclusion because that would have stalled the entire project because no one had started the work yet. Maybe by like 2025, 2026, we'll start seeing HDR generally on the desktop, but it's still a little bit away. However, it is very exciting. VRR, variable refresh rate, along with the tear protocol for minimum latency in games. This is something you just get in WL Roots. The only thing that doesn't support this at this point, because GNOME. Disabling input devices, X input alternative. Once again, at this point, every single base has generic tooling to do this. Absolute positioning for Windows. This links to the really old issue from 2 whole years ago. This basically got laughed out of the room because they were trying to fix a problem in MPV, and the developers just didn't think it was a very important use case. Nowadays, there is a whole new protocol developed by Matthias Klump. I've talked about the protocol many times, along with the different versions of the protocol, all 3 different versions, but that's not what we're talking about today. This is very much a work in progress that should hopefully get resolved if they can stop bickering. Crash resistance. A Wayland compositor going down means all your apps crashing. This also happens on Xorg, and this is part of the reason why network transparency is kind of a joke nowadays. A lot of the toolkits are really not happy about your display server dying, and just don't know what to do about it. This is currently being worked on by a KDE developer by the name of David Edmondson, and is going to be resolved. All these features and API are re-implemented again and again by all the Wayland compositors. The existing libraries, e.g. WL Roots or libwestern, only help so much. Why are we talking about such an extreme amount of duplication of work and code and a ton of effort required to debug and make these features work reliably? I know a lot of Wayland devs aren't going to agree with this, but this is absolutely correct. A lot of compositors have needlessly duplicated code. Where I disagree, though, is whether or not the model itself is bad. Is it bad? Or could the libraries be improved to make the process simpler and deal with a lot more of this boilerplate code that everybody just needs to write? There were projects that tried to address this. For example, Louvre. This intended to be a much simpler way to build a Wayland compositor, sort of automating a lot of the stuff that WL Roots just made you write. The problem is the project kind of just hasn't gone anywhere. The last commits in anything are 2 months ago. And look, building something like this is incredibly complex and incredibly time consuming, and I understand why it went away. Maybe it'll come back. I hope it does. But as it currently stands, what we are doing is building these solutions. But right now, nobody's interested in building something akin to Xorg. The library path is the way we're going, so it's probably better to improve that than throw away all the stuff we're doing now. This all sounds like too high of a price to pay for ostensibly improved security guaranteed by Wayland. Not a single person, however, has provided a single proof of Xorg's insecurity ever being abused to gain unauthorized access to the user account. To abuse Xorg's insecurity model, you first need to be able to run applications within the user session, and at least Linux users normally don't run random applications from the net. This is blatantly untrue. How many of you have installed a package from the AUR and didn't read the package build? A package build lets you run literally any command that you want. How many of you have seen the really stupid way to install an application often seen on GitHub, where it's like, hey, run this bash script piped into sudo? Don't do that, firstly. But that's a common thing that people do. Anyone who thinks for at least a second is gonna look at the script and be like, okay, is this safe or not? But oftentimes people just grab the command and whoop, run the command. Who really cares what it does? Now, to be fair, I do think some of the examples of Xorg insecurity are completely overblown. For example, you'll often hear Wayland devs say, oh, an application can redraw any other window. So what if it decides to redraw a password prompt for whatever application you have? Yeah, that's a real problem. But do you have a single real-world example of it actually happening? That is a very targeted and very specific problem. If that's happening on your system, you have a lot more serious problems than someone redrawing a window. As it currently stands, the Wayland compositor cannot be reloaded or replaced on the fly without taking down all the running graphical applications. Actually, they can. Literally, all of them can do that. Certain Wayland compositors cannot change their settings on the fly and require a full restart, which sounds crazy in 2021. That's true for certain X11 window managers as well, like that's nothing to do with Wayland. Qt has fixed the issue internally, but every toolkit must implement it as well. Some applications, e.g. MPV, don't use any major toolkits, such as GTK or Qt. What does this have to do with Wayland? As it currently stands, minor window managers and desktop environments do not even intend to support Wayland, given the sheer complexity of writing all the code required to support the above features. You do not expect JWM, TWM, XDM, or even IceWM developers to implement all the features outlined in number 1. To be fair, I am surprised that any of these still have users, let alone developers. I talked about this in a previous video. This is a really uncomfortable truth of Wayland. It's a really uncomfortable truth of really anything in software development. Sometimes software doesn't get ported. Sometimes projects will be left behind in history, and that's okay. Some window managers are simply never going to be ported to Wayland. That would have happened regardless of how the architecture worked. If we had a generic implementation like we do on Xorg, if we're doing what we're doing now, there are going to be some projects that just don't. Just like Linux no longer runs on the Intel 8386. Sometimes things get left behind, sometimes things get removed, and nobody wants to work on it anymore. Now, there are some kinda solutions that exist that I would like to see improved. For example, running these inside of a rootless X Wayland session, and then running that on top of some lightweight compositor, DWL, Sway, whatever you want to go with, so you have the X11 thing running inside of X Wayland, which is basically just Xorg, and it's running on top of Wayland, and that theoretically should just keep working as long as we want to keep X Wayland around. The only problem is having multiple monitors, which currently is not supported by X Wayland, but I did report a problem, and there is some discussion about it. So maybe that will happen in the future, but I wouldn't hold out too much hope. Or instead of that, rather than just building something entirely from scratch, which seems like a lot of wasted effort, why don't you just fork off of something that already exists, whether that be Sway, Hyperland, River, so on and so forth? I think a lot of people forget how many X11 window managers started as a fork of another project. A lot of those weren't just written from scratch. Like, Awesome WM, for example, is a DWM fork. And number 4, well-established competing desktop OSs work exactly this way. Actually, none of them work this way because none of them support the kind of custom desktops that exist on Linux and the BSD side. I don't even know what this is supposed to be referring to. I wonder if Wayland developers could maybe consider writing a reference Wayland server which provided all these features and APIs and only required window managers and desktop environments to provide a very simple window manager which drew window decorations. And of course, Simon Sir of the WRoots project chimed in on this. I don't think this makes sense. We can't possibly have a single reference Wayland server which fits each and every use case without ending up with something like Xorg. Side note, Xorg doesn't fit all use cases. I think building libraries to help bring up Wayland compositors is the way to go. When he says this, what he means is things like the VR desktops, which realistically are only now becoming possible on Wayland. And there are a lot of other ideas that people might have that simply couldn't have been done when everybody is building for this exact same stack. To which he did partially agree. Xorg naturally doesn't fit all the use cases, but it makes writing window managers a breeze. It allows you to have all of the outline features centrally, fast and error-free. Definitely not error-free. Right now, dozens of features and APIs must be implemented, debugged, and properly optimized by all Wayland compositors. More like they need to be properly optimized by the base that you are building off of. The simplest example. I want to configure, using a GUI or utility like Xrender, my monitors in Wayfire. Currently, not only it's not possible, I have to learn Wayfire's very specific configuration files and painstakingly edit them to suit my needs. So there is a solution, you just don't like the solution that is currently presented. Also, you don't actually need to configure it like that, because even back at this point, there were tools like WLRrender, WDisplays, Can't-She, which work across basically most of the WRoots compositors. Maybe it doesn't work in Wayfire, but I'd really doubt that. But this is the key point. Nothing stops you from writing a good opinionated Wayland compositor library which would fit only the use cases of these window managers in particular, and hell, nothing stops you from writing a Wayland compositor which works the same way X11 does. The issue is developers in the upstream project are not interested in doing this. They are not interested in creating Xorg 2.0 because Xorg is just unmaintainable. It's way too big of a code base. You need the kind of funding that existed back in the early 2000s to make something like that actually a viable project. Something a lot more viable is working on these libraries and then having the individuals who want to make a Wayland compositor build the compositor stack themselves and work on a much smaller use case that's actually kind of maintainable, not having this giant thing that nobody even wants to look at, to be honest. Now, ultimately, this issue did get closed by Simon, closing because this issue isn't actionable, to which Brodie was not super happy about. Very much actionable, and should be considered urgent unless everyone's okay with basically 2 full-feature compositors for Wayland, Mutter and Kwin, plus a dozen of minor compositors which are barely functional, severely limited, and not providing a ton of features. This is definitely not true nowadays. We have things like Sway, we have Hikari, which existed back then, we have River, we have Hyperland. That didn't turn out to be true. I'm not going to reopen it since you're the boss here, but I'll continue to post links to this issue everywhere I can. People have to know. This is something he has continued doing, especially outside of the repo, because if he does it in the repo, he's going to get very banned. By the way, can we have a sort of vote on this, whether it's worth closing or not? I don't take it lightly that Wayland has numerous developers, and you've personally decided for the rest of them, while no one before you objected to the bug report / feature request, despite it being open for months. I think the reason why nobody objected is nobody even thought it was worth addressing. Then the developers did start addressing it. If you knew the architecture of Wayland, then you'd know that making a single Wayland compositor that works for everyone is literally impossible. To make a single compositor that works with window manager of choice, you just end up writing a huge set of new protocols as a compositor to window manager interface or similar and end up at Xorg 2.0, which is not the goal and will require another rewrite in only a few years. Some of the problems you're citing lack generic solutions. That's true. Some of them nowadays do have generic solutions though. You're mistaken though that the issue is the implementations, quite the opposite even. There being multiple implementations makes it a lot faster to implement things like global shortcuts, because non-standard API that normal applications shouldn't use directly has no stability and only low security requirements. If you want to make things progress faster, please read into how Wayland really works, where its design decisions come from, and what the design philosophy for new protocols is, what current protocols allow, and what its current shortcomings are, and then make actionable suggestions. There's plenty of stalled work that could use another helping hand. Never has there been a truer true than this final sentence here. And of course, Brodie responds again. I'm okay with having a single compositor for the desktop. I was recently told that Red Hat devised Wayland as a protocol for IoT, where apps are always full screen and there's just a single input device, e.g. touch input. This is also just not true because you do have multiple input devices on IoT devices sometimes. But Wayland is touted as a replacement for Xorg/X11. It's never been touted as very lean, something you have to add tens of thousands of lines of code to make it a replacement for Xorg server/X11. Well, it was touted as a protocol, not an implementation, so there's also, obviously, you're going to have to write tens of thousands of code to be able to use the protocol. But the main point here is that the developers of Wayland aren't okay with having a single compositor, because if they have a single compositor, that means they have to make something generic that is going to work for everyone. And that is a giant project. It's Xorg 2.0, and nobody wants to maintain it. If they did, they'd be maintaining Xorg already. And then for some reason references Windows. It's weird. Microsoft has succeeded in that beautifully. They transitioned from an Xorg-like architecture in Windows 3.0 to XP to a compositor-like architecture in Windows Vista onwards. I'm sure this can be done, and I'm not sure where would require another rewrite in only a few years comes from. I have no idea what this is supposed to be getting at. Maybe it's saying that after XP, you have these fancy compositor features and all these shader stuff, but that has nothing to do with having these generic desktops that you can just like plug in as you feel like it. You can't do that on Windows. You have DWM, not the Linux DWM. The window manager on Windows is also called DWM, and that's all you get. Now, as Brodie was not happy with this outcome, he started doing something that got him in a bit of trouble. So there were various other issues, like autotype in login form, where he posted this. This is basically a dupe of 233, which has just been closed by Mr. Simon Sir. This has nothing to do with 233. He also posted a comment down here, which got deleted by Daniel Stone. Also, there is this one here. Place window to specific location. Related to 233. At least this one is related. But, Daniel wasn't super happy about this going on. Wayland and X11 are conceptually different with different trade-offs. Most of the examples you provided do not come for free from using Xorg, but require active awareness and participation from every window manager and every client. If you look into how full-featured and universally compatible X11 window managers actually work, you'll see a ton of workarounds for clients which do not implement these protocols correctly or at all. Equally, client toolkits have a pile of workarounds for buggy window managers. If you build an app for X11 with Unity, you will note that it offers you the choice of 7 different methods for full screen. Wayland as a project has no desire to provide a single reference environment implementing everything you are demanding. Some of it is out of scope, some of it doesn't solve the actual problem, e.g. Wayland can't provide a system tray if the window manager doesn't provide UI for a system tray, so fundamentally, the window manager still needs to implement it. The comparison with Windows does not make sense because Windows only has a single environment and window manager, so they only have to implement things once. We don't have that luxury. Sorry if this isn't the conclusion you're after, but as one of the major design points for several years, this has already been discussed a great deal. It's not that we've never thought about doing what you're demanding, but that we have thought about it and reached a different conclusion to you. Since that event happening, he has continued to update the description all the way up to about 4 months ago, and continues to reference it in various other places on the internet. If you see Brodie somewhere, ask him about 233, and he'll send you the link very, very quickly. So, if you were ever wondering whether a Xorg-like project would come from upstream Wayland, the answer is probably no. If somebody wants to build it though, go ahead and do so, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for one. So, hopefully you learned something today. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you run X11? Do you run Wayland? What are you currently using as your desktop? Let me know. you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Libera Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and this is not the way.
Something like this.